3 men volunteered to walk into a flooded basement underneath a burning reactor. 8 days earlier, Reactor 4 at Chernobyl had thrown its 1,000-ton lid through the roof, and what was left of the core was still melting downward, toward the water they would be standing in. The fear in Moscow that week was not the fire. It was a second explosion, a steam explosion, and the number attached to it was 3 to 5 megatons. Whether that number was ever real is the argument at the center of this story. What is not in dispute is that 3 men put on wetsuits and went into the dark water to find 2 valves. Chernobyl stands about 90 miles north of Kyiv, in what was then Soviet Ukraine, beside a town built for the plant's own workers and named Pripyat. The station ran 4 RBMK reactors, a Soviet design nobody outside the Union built. It was cheap, it was enormous, and it had a flaw its designers had documented and its operators had never been told about. At low power, the reactor became unstable. Worse, the control rods meant to shut it down were tipped with graphite, and for the first seconds of insertion, graphite made the reaction faster, not slower. The test that night was, of all things, a safety test. Engineers wanted to know whether a dying turbine could keep the cooling pumps turning during the gap between a blackout and the diesel generator starting. It had been attempted 3 times before and had failed 3 times. This attempt was delayed 10 hours by the grid controller in Kyiv, which pushed it onto the night shift, a crew that had not trained for it. By the time they began, the reactor had sunk to roughly 30 megawatts thermal, a fraction of the intended level, poisoned by xenon gas. The written procedure said to shut down. They pulled control rods out instead and coaxed it back to 200. At 23 minutes past 1 in the morning, the shift supervisor pressed the emergency shutdown. Every rod entered the core at once, graphite ends first. In about 4 seconds, the power rose to something like 100 times the reactor's design maximum. The fuel shattered. Steam pressure lifted the upper biological shield, a disk of concrete and steel weighing around 1,000 tons, and threw it aside. A second blast followed seconds later, and the building was open to the sky. Around 2,000 tons of graphite in the core caught fire and burned for 9 days, carrying the contents of that core into the air over Europe. The first firefighters arrived within minutes and were told they were fighting a fire on a roof. They were not told what was in the smoke because the men who called them did not know either. They fought it standing on bitumen that was softening under their boots, beside lumps of graphite that had been inside the core an hour earlier and were reading hundreds of Röntgen an hour. 2 men died that night. 28 more died of acute radiation syndrome within months. 134 were formally diagnosed with it. Pripyat, a town of about 49,000 people 3 kilometers away, was not evacuated for 36 hours. People went to work. Children went to school. A wedding went ahead. Helicopters flew over the open reactor and dropped sand, clay, boron, lead, and dolomite, around 5,000 tons of it, trying to smother the graphite fire from above. It worked in the sense that the fire went out. It also created the next problem because 5,000 tons of material lying on top of a melting core does an excellent job of trapping heat. Directly beneath Reactor 4 were 2 large tanks called bubbler pools, part of the pressure suppression system. Above them sat what the core had become, a moving mass of molten fuel, sand, concrete, and steel. That mixture, later given the name corium, was hot enough to melt through the floors under it. It was already traveling downward, and nobody could see it or measure it directly. The pools had partly filled with water from the firefighting above and from cooling pipes that had ruptured in the explosion. The physicists doing the arithmetic in Moscow reached a conclusion that stopped the room. Several hundred tons of corium at around 2,000 degrees, dropping into standing water inside a sealed concrete box, would flash that water to steam instantly. The figure that circulated was 3 to 5 megatons. Such a blast, the argument ran, would scatter what remained of the core across a continent and make a large part of Europe unlivable. Whether the physics ever supported that number is something we're going to come back to. What matters for what happened next is that the men in charge believed it, and the solution they landed on was ordinary plumbing. The pools had 2 gate valves. Open them, and the water drains away. The valves sat in a flooded corridor in the basement, in the dark, underneath a reactor that was still burning. Somebody had to wade in and turn them by hand. 3 men from the plant's own staff went. Alexei Ananenko, a senior mechanical engineer, knew where the valves were. Valery Bezbalov was an engineer. Boris Baranov was the shift supervisor, and he carried the lamp. They wore wetsuits and respirators and carried a dosimeter. The lamp failed partway in, so they found the pipework by feel in the dark and followed it with their hands until it led them to the valves. They found both valves. They opened them. The water went down, and over the following days, something like 20,000 cubic meters drained out of the space beneath the reactor. The version of this story told for the next 30 years ended with all 3 dying of radiation sickness within weeks. It reached print, then television, then a prestige drama watched by millions. It is not true. Ananenko and Bezbalov both survived and were alive decades afterwards. Baranov died in 2005 of heart failure at 65. In 2018, Ukraine awarded all 3 the Order for Courage. So what about the 3 to 5 megatons? This is where the story usually stops, and it should not, because that number does not survive contact with the physics. A steam explosion is not a nuclear explosion. It converts stored heat into mechanical energy at a few % efficiency, and the heat available in that corium was nowhere near megaton scale to begin with. Later analysis puts the plausible energy of such an event smaller by orders of magnitude than the figure that circulated in May 1986. Destructive, certainly. Continental, no. There's a second question, too. How much water was actually still down there by the 4th of May? Some accounts hold that much of it had already drained away through damaged pipes before the 3 men ever arrived. None of that makes what they did smaller. They walked into a flooded basement under a burning reactor, believing the number was real. Being wrong about the size of a danger is not the same as not facing it. And the corium did keep moving. It ran down through pipes and stairwells and set hard in a corridor as a mass that was photographed years later and nicknamed the elephant foot, still lethal to stand beside. Cleaning up took roughly 600,000 people, called liquidators, pulled in from across the Soviet Union. Miners dug a tunnel underneath the reactor to install a cooling system that in the end was never needed. A concrete sarcophagus was thrown up over the ruin in about 200 days by men working shifts measured in seconds. It was always meant to be temporary, and it began failing within a decade. In 2016, a steel arch 110 meters tall was slid over the entire structure on rails, built at a distance, and moved into place. It is designed to hold for 100 years. Pripyat was never reoccupied. The exclusion zone runs to about 1,000 square miles, and the death toll is still one of the most argued numbers in modern history, 31 or tens of thousands, depending entirely on what you agree to count. The reactor design was quietly modified across the Soviet Union after 1986. Several RBMK reactors are still generating power today, with that flaw corrected. The men who went into the water are the part that stays. Not because a continent was saved, that number was probably never real, but because of what they believed they were walking into. 3 men put on wetsuits and went down into the dark to turn 2 valves by hand. They believed it would kill them, and they went anyway.